John, you were also a very close personal friend to Pope Francis. Now, he'll be buried in a modest grave, turning away centuries of tradition to embrace the humility that we've seen from him since 2013. How will you remember him?
I remember him as someone who, on one level, as your colleague was just saying, lives in the modest apartment. He did not want to move into the 12-room apartment in the Apostolic Palace, which, as you know, it's very grand, marble, it's very cold, it's a bit like a tomb. He thought, what am I going to do there? He lives in the guest house. He would dine and he would be available to have dinner, and there was always the joke in that he would always like to eat off the buffet. So there would be times when we'd walk in, I'd stay at the guest house with him. He'd be sitting in the corner sometimes, and you knew if he was sitting on his own, he wanted to eat and be on his own. But quite often, he would come into the room. He'd see who else was in the room. And if he decided he wanted to be social, he would sit and join them. So he had an element of humility, an element of humor. He loved to play jokes, but also he had a great sense of humanity and compassion. And I think that's probably more than anything else. That's how he's going to be remembered. The images of him in the first Last Supper, washing the feet, the images of him even last week going to the prison, and of course making the jokes with the prisoners saying, "You're here, they did manage to catch me, otherwise I'd be here." And he had a great sense of humor, and I also saw that humor a lot. He would often talk to me about his meetings with world leaders, and they were always slotted in the diary for 30 minutes. And if he didn't like the world leader or didn't feel comfortable with him, he would find a way to reduce the meeting to 10 minutes. So I always got a sense from talking to him as to which leaders he respected or was engaged with, and which leaders he wanted to reduce their time slot from 30 to 20 to 10 minutes.
And he was tough, actually. He was also tough on some of the world leaders and some of their stances, right?
Oh,
he was quite tough on President Trump and J.D. Vance when it came to deportation of immigrants.
Yeah, I've used the analogy that there's an Old Testament, rather stern, imperial Pope Francis, and there's a New Testament, Christ-like, compassionate, non-judgmental New Testament Pope Francis. And those two coexisted, and depending on the message, depending on the audience, and depending on what he was trying to accomplish. But he knew exactly who he was, he knew where he came from, and he knew where he was going.
John, is there a worry that actually this legacy of compassion, but also being interested in world affairs, putting poverty, I guess, at the center of his focus, is lost with the next pope?
Well, this pope is focused very much on inclusivity, broadening how the Catholic Church welcomed people into it and accepting people. And also, he didn't like people who were indifferent to poverty. I think when we're talking about legacies, we have to be careful. Everyone wants to write his legacy this week. But let's look at the last two popes. It took years for people to appreciate the role that John Paul II has played in history. Pope Benedict, people just originally saw him as a transitional pope, as an administrator, but now he's actually regarded through his writings, and his book Jesus of Nazareth is extraordinary, as probably one of the most important German theologians in 200 years. So you need to give popes and their legacies some time to really understand their impact and what happens. And sometimes we'll see what happens with the conclave. Sometimes conclaves are a reaction, sometimes they're a reaffirmation.
What do you think will happen? I mean, it's impossible because of the different factions, right? And this pope actually almost came out of nowhere.
Well, he was very much the sort of runner-up candidate at the time Pope Benedict was elected. Now you have 137 cardinals who are able to vote. canon law suggests there'd be about 120 that would be allowed to vote. It depends. There's factions. What happens in the room? But we do know one thing from the book and the movie Conclave. Those who perhaps aspire to it are not necessarily the ones the Holy Spirit accepts.